Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Let's get ready to rumble!
It's showtime.
Indeed it is. It's showtime. We're all set to go. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And to mark the occasion, I've got my Ontario Highway 1 ball cap on this morning. And lots to talk about, so we won't linger off the top. We'll welcome in the birthday boy is here, Keith Leslie. Yeah. And do they sing you happy birthday on CH, Keith?
No, they did not, and they will not on this podcast either.
Are you sure? we might have to take a vote around the table. John Wright is here. He is our founding pollster. Was one of two guys in the room who thought it was a good idea to start the podcast back in 2018, and here we are. Kathleen Wynne is with us, the former Premier of Ontario and the former PC leader at Queen's Park is Tim Hudak. As a note, Tim, I gather we got some notes on our previous programming from the finance minister, did we?
Yeah. Good news. Our grade has improved. So you might remember that we talked about the deposit return and who has to take the bottles back. And Peter Bethenfalvey, the finance minister, watches the show. So I got a bit of a scolding call correcting the record. And then he watched the second show, right, where we corrected the record. However, we did make one mistake. I'm not going to point out which in the class got in trouble. But
it'll be me again, I'm betting.
that have to take empties are small grocers, 4,000 square feet and above, that are 5 kilometers or further from a beer store. Will come small ones. So hopefully, finance minister, I got that right. He did up our grade from a failure to a B plus. So we're on our way.
Oh, to not a middling. Well, that's okay. We'll take that. All right. Well, glad to. It's just like having a program director all of a sudden. I thought I was past that. We don't need that shit anymore. All right. If anybody doubts that we are into campaigns, just had to pay attention to what was going on with the advertising. And I think some of the conversation in question period. I know we kind of turn up our nose at the effectiveness of question period sometimes, but happened to have it on this week. And I was just flipping through the YouTube channel and noticed that clearly Marit Stiles has a very specific and particular nail that she wants to drive, and that is healthcare. And it sounds like, that's their message all week long in the legislature at Queen's Park. And she started off by taking a shot at 6 years of Ford government.
This question's for the Premier. After 6 years of this government, the state of our healthcare has only gotten worse in the province of Ontario. Just ask the people of Huron, Perth, folks in towns like Stratford and Seaforth and Clinton, who have faced ongoing emergency room closures and reduced hours.
Thank you, Speaker. It must be NDP math today. 4% increase year over year for hospital operating budgets. $85 million increase in hospital capital and expansions. We're making the investments to not only make sure that we have primary care physicians who are training in the province of Ontario, when respectfully, the last time the NDP government were in power, they were actually cutting residency and hospital positions.
I'll tell you what, Speaker, I'll give her some Tory math, shall I? Some conservative math. 1,000 emergency room closures last year. 1,000. The minister's words do not match the reality of the people of Ontario. Healthcare in Ontario is worse than it has ever been under this government.
Yeah, so like us, we got scolded on the Tory math, Keith. It just becomes one of those things where I can see how this is shaping up, and I understand the health ministers and the deputy premier's comment and response, and there's this long litany of this is what we've done and checklist that and checklist that. I don't know that resonates as well as what the NDP is talking about. This is lived experience with people who are going to hospitals or who are not able to get the services that they need. That's going to be a hard thing to fight.
Yes, they're making an awful lot of investments in healthcare, and they're trying to address these issues. But the bottom line are or bottom line is rather, that when someone has to go to an emergency department and it's closed, if you're in Seaforth and you find out, oh no, I have to drive another 70, 80 kilometers to the next emergency department because it's closed. 1,000 closures. These are happening on weekends, sometimes for the entire weekend, sometimes in the middle of the week. It's basically a staffing issue, but it's something the government clearly is not addressing. Just these talking points in the health minister about the investments they're making, their math. Well, I think the Marit Stiles point in this was terrific. The bang on math is 1,000 emergency department closures in the past year under this government. That's shocking. And for people who have actually experienced this firsthand, we all know that the distance from where you're having trouble, where you're having a medical emergency to a hospital is crucial. It's crucial to get to an emergency department. And the fact that, local ones are being closed on weekends, people still get sick on weekends, as we know. So this is just something that this government is going to wear. And I think the NDP are right to bang on this and to stay focused on this. And we notice the Liberals as well are also going on the healthcare. They're talking about the number of people every day, about the number of people in each riding that don't have a family doctor. So I think that both opposition parties are onto something here, because I think clearly the Ford government, despite all its boasts of its investments in healthcare and long-term care and home care, they're vulnerable on all these fronts.
Yeah, John, again, we get back to it, whether perception is reality, whether this is good politics or good policy. And to me, I think it's just in terms of attitude and a lot of the things we've talked about lately, it's the perceptual issue that they're going to have to struggle with.
Well, but I think it goes back to what Keith just said, and that is, and that's the lived experience. I mean, it's very interesting to watch this because there are millions of people that don't have access to a family doctor. And we know that not only in this province, but across the country. We have the federal government who claims to be doing lots for our lives anyways on the economy, and yet we feel not that great about it. It's the same situation here. I was actually out the other day speaking with someone who's in the long-term care area, and it was an interesting discussion because the view was whether or not, and the finance minister may be listening to this, I mean, it was one of those things where it's kind of like, look, we've got a runway, and you've heard me talk about this before, until about 2036. When the baby boomer impact on the healthcare system is going to be massive. And the long-term care crunch is really between 2036 and 2041 or 2. And that's as predictable as you can get, because you can see the demographic headed in that direction. And then the comment was kind of, and it wasn't something that was, hoping for a business case to be made, but it was kind of like, look, they just gave away $3 billion. $1 billion that would have been means tested to people would have been a nice back in the pocket to go with the with anything the federal government could be throwing, let's say, even at the GST for kids on that relief front. But also we could have taken $2 billion and put it towards long-term care. And it would have been a demonstrable thing that they could have said, we're putting shovels in the ground. I think there's a disconnect between if you say, look, you're getting a budget increase of 4% or you're doing this in a certain sector, and people are not seeing it on the ground with the shovels in the ground and seeing that there's progress made, but also about what they're feeling and the anxiety. I must say, I'm not talking for the other people here, especially with Keith with his birthday today, but for people like me, I mean, this is coming fast and hard, in the next decade for me. And it's kind of like very concerning as a voter that this is not being looked at. So I think it's the lived experience, which is disconnecting from the promises that you're hearing.
Kathleen Wynne, where's that balance? Because I know both you and Tim have been in that war room situation where you've got to balance off between what the perception is and what good policy is, and how do you split that atom?
Well, I just want to follow up on something that John said in terms of the investments in long-term care. I've been really surprised that in the aftermath of COVID, or as we came to the end of COVID, that there wasn't a big investment in healthcare by this government. I just haven't understood it in terms of the politics or the policy, because obviously it was the healthcare system that struggled enormously under COVID, long-term care in particular. But the staffing shortages that have come about because of what happened during COVID are real. And, I'm not surprised now that as we go into what looks like it's going to be an early election, that healthcare is an issue, because I think it's a vulnerability of this government. 4% sounds like a lot. My guess is, and I don't know this, but my guess is that the healthcare costs are growing at about 6%. And so 4% is not keeping up. That's just based on my experience. I would suggest that that's the number. So that would be felt in the hospitals, in the communities. I think it's very smart that the government has brought Jane Philpott on to look at the primary care delivery, but it's going to take time to, to ensure that everyone in the province has a family physician or a nurse practitioner. So I'm not surprised that this is where the opposition's going, because I don't think the government got on this fast enough when we were coming out of COVID.
Tim, is this just a problem that's too big to get your arms around? I mean, this has been a chronic problem for, a decade, and it has obviously been exacerbated by COVID.
Well, here's the dark little secret from behind the doors at Queen's Park. You're never going to fix healthcare. It's like a pretty heavily used vehicle, and you could, tighten up the bolts in the car. You can get more miles out of it, but you're never going to fix it. Here's another story about, why this is hard. At least, I don't know, and Kathleen can talk with the Liberal side. On the Conservative side, man, you want to avoid healthcare. That was a ministry that was going to be constantly putting out fires. You can never satisfy all the demands. And believe it or not, Dave, we had some of my colleagues who took up smoking so they would be disqualified from ever being considered health minister. That was your get out of jail free card on that file. The reality is, look, it's a publicly run, poorly coordinated system. You don't have to pay to use it, so you have overuse. The hospital incentive is to treat fewer people to keep more money, right? This is the nature of our system. You can put money at it to paper over that problem, but eventually it's going to break down. To your main point, yes, I therefore think it is a good angle for Marit Stiles and the New Democrats to go after. I thought she came across really well there in question period, which matched up, I think, nicely with the message you want to drive and her own strength in communication. It was a strong performance.
Well, let's get to the other opposition party, the unofficial opposition party. The Liberals were out with their ad campaign this week, and I'm just going to play it without comment, and I'm curious to see what you guys have to say about it.
6 years ago, Doug Ford said he had a plan for the people.
For the people. For the people. A government that works for the people.
But which people did he mean?
Ontario's premier is responding to intense criticism of his government's plan to open up protected land to a small group of well-connected developers.
The Ford government's plan to close some Service Ontario locations, replacing them with kiosks inside Staples Canada stores.
That's my only question. I'm with you. Why Staples? Who does someone know in the provincial government?
The Ford government is speeding up access to beer and wine in corner stores, but in exchange, Ontarians will have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to a private company just to make it happen.
And while he's been helping his friends, everything's gotten worse.
The Ontario College of Family Physicians now says there are 2.5 million Ontarians without a family doctor.
New report in Ontario is highlighting the growing use of food banks in this province.
A new report suggests home prices need to drop by more than $500,000 for millennials to be able to afford a home in Ontario.
Because the truth is, Doug Ford isn't in it for you. The people he's in it for are the people who cut up checks.
Now, here's the struggle I have with this, John. I think that the checklist of issues is the right angle here. I think that makes sense. But if you are listening to this show on a podcast platform, you don't see the fancy graphics that have the play on for the people, for his friends, that kind of thing. I'm not sure I'd be using his campaign song in their own campaign ad. just me.
No, and it introduces the premier saying that he's for the people, for the people, for the people. Look, I from a very nonpartisan basis look at this ad and say it's just poorly executed. You don't lead with your opponent saying he's for something that resonates. You don't put his soundtrack in the back, and it's actually probably 5 30-second clips as opposed to 1.5 minutes to 2 minute. However many minutes it is, to do something like that. I just find that it's the execution. They had a lot to say, but it just doesn't resonate. I think if we go to the previous clip, at least Marit Stiles is zeroing in on one topic and nailing it, as opposed to the Liberal Party, who could be looking at 4 topics and nailing it very, very concisely. I get what they're trying to say. I think in the last podcast, we talked about even Bill Davis. Back when he first took over, there were, he was seen as the cigar smoking pinstripe guy in the back of the limousine helping his friends. And then Ed Stewart and Norman Atkins came along and Claire Westcott, and they changed his image into Brampton Billy. You've already got Brampton Billy in a way with Doug Ford, but I don't think that the Liberals are able to frame it in the same way. And I'd give them on a touchdown or fumble. This is a fumble for me.
Kathleen Wynne, we were talking at some point a few weeks ago just about, the number one thing in communications is not to repeat the negative. And to John's point, I get what they're doing, but it shocked me that the first, 5-10 seconds off the top is the Premier saying, "I'm for the people."
Yeah, well, as a Liberal, I can't be nonpartisan in this conversation. As a Liberal, I'm glad that the theme of who's he helping is going to be what they're focusing on, because I think that's a huge personal vulnerability of Ford's. Is the ad long? Does it start? I'm not an advertising professional, and who knows, but
surely at some point in the campaign, somebody floated these things by you to say.
Oh yes, they did. They absolutely did. I guess I'm loath to be too negative. We're at the beginning. I think that this theme is important. I think they've got the right theme. I'd kind of turn it around. I'd probably lead with our message and maybe bring him in at the end. But I think that they're onto the right vulnerability. This guy's doing stuff because it's going to benefit the people who he wants to like him. That's what he does. So I think it's absolutely the right message, and Keith, it will be refined, I am sure.
Keith, it reminds me though of watching the returns on the election night for the U.S. presidential election, and people saying, "Well, it's still early." I mean, you're going to run out of runway here.
Well, this ad strikes me as I'm glad you brought up the U.S. election, because it strikes me that they called Ford everything but a threat to democracy. Which, as we saw, just did not play with the American voters. And I don't think this is going to play with Ford's supporters. Absolutely use that checklist of things that he's done wrong, the Greenbelt scandal, the healthcare crisis, all these different things that they've messed up or not addressed properly. But first of all, I didn't know who that ad was for. Is it for the Liberals or the New Democrats? I mean, unless it says at the end paid for by the Liberal Party, you're absolutely, to Kathleen, Premier Wynn's point, lead with your strong points, lead with what you're going to do, and then, come back into him at the end. I also really, really didn't like the message that it was the Polyev echo of a message coming from the Liberals. Everything has gotten worse. Everything. I mean, don't tell me the country's broken. Don't tell me Ontario is just point out where it's worse. Point out what's gotten worse. Absolutely. But to say everything has gotten worse is just a nihilistic message that I don't think gives me any reason to want to vote for you. And I'm still not sure who you are because of that ad. It didn't tell me who the heck you are.
Tim, I can't wait to hear the finance minister's notes on that ad.
Yeah. It strikes me, two things. To Keith's point, that was a Liberal ad, right? Like it was not. It was
question mark. Yeah.
A double check there. So, I appreciate the way you've juxtaposed these, because I think the NDP attack was far more coherent and better delivered. This struck me as a goulash of a whole bunch of stuff thrown in a pot and stirred around, and I think it's tough to cut through. Here's my I think more important point on this. It strikes me for the Ontario Liberal Party, there's a bit of haphazard nature to what we've seen in the last couple of weeks. I don't know if it's a panic or a lack of organization. We praised Bonnie Crombie last week on clarity, an announcement around taking the HST off heat and hydro, right? But then like a few days later, they introduced another business tax reduction, I think in question period, and then a relatively incoherent ad. This looks to me like they're responding to the government and the government's branding in a way that doesn't look organized or really coherent to voters out there. So early stages, sure, just looks a little scrambled.
Yeah, John, it would have been one of those things where this was the perfect time to say, are you better off today than you were? And then go through that litany of issues.
I don't know. Let me take it a different tack on that. To Tim's point, Bonnie Crombie had talked about tax relief. And I mean, they've been attacked for years now as being, the taxing party. And I think what we talked about last week was that Bonnie Crombie managed to get in the wedge where she used the opportunity to talk about what they were going to do to reduce taxes, which deflect then from the government. I got to tell you, that's where I would have gone with this ad. I would have put together 10-second, 30-second spots on promoting the fact that that's where their party stood. I would have taken the clips around the announcement and everything and just kept driving it and driving it and driving it, so that by the time you got to the election campaign, you'd be able to say, at least some people had heard that you were there. You know, having a stand-up scrum and saying it or making an announcement once, you and I know that in this world, you've got to have constant repetitiveness in order to get out there and get people to know about it. I think that's where I would have headed with this. I would have just kept pounding and pounding and pounding until people knew that I was in favor of tax cuts as opposed to having my wagon painted every day.
But you know, I mean, ads have to do different things, right? And Ford, yeah. So Bonnie Crombie wasn't in this ad, and the message was way broader than certainly. I mean, Marit Stiles was standing up in the legislature asking a question. That's different than running. That's different than creating
Completely.
an ad.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that what they're trying to do is they got to take Ford's likability down a bit, right? And he's got it. People they have to try to kind of tag him with this stuff. And so it seems to me that's what this ad is about. There are all sorts of other things that have to be done. I get that. But I think this ad had a specific purpose of targeting his image and trying to give people a bit of a view of his darker side. That's what I think.
And I still think, and I said this last week, I'm not convinced yet that he's in it for other people and not for you, rather than making it about me specifically. And it's a subtle, nuanced thing, but in any kind of communications, when we're doing a show like this, it's got to be something that the audience identifies with specifically. And telling people what to think doesn't work. Telling them how they feel works. That's how Ailes made Fox blow up and be so great at what it does, whether you like the message or not. So I think there's a thread there that is threadbare in terms of that. He's the bad guy in the corner, and we should kind of run against that or run on that.
Dave, just one quick thing. My former leader, Spidey sense is really going off here. I will wager this was either the leader herself or the team saying, we got to get an ad out, throw something together and put it on there. It just doesn't look coherent, and I think you'll see a shift in that in the time ahead.
Well, let's compare that now. The Tories were out with their campaign ad, and just for those of you listening, it starts with the Premier in the car.
It's about listening to people. A lot of elected officials, they just don't get it. I give my phone number out to absolutely everyone. You have to return calls, you have to talk to people, agree or disagree with them. They tell me, Doug, I'm sick of being stuck in traffic. It never ends. That's why we're building new roads, highways, transit. Thanks for doing this, guys. And unlike Bonnie Crombie's Liberals, we'll never put a toll on your trip or a bike lane on a major road. I hear complaints about needles in parks. People don't want drug injection sites next to schools and playgrounds. That's why we're closing them down. But what I hear the most, things are expensive out there. And I get it. I really do. People just can't afford Trudeau's carbon tax. You just got to get rid of that terrible carbon tax. It's made everything more expensive. That's why we cut the gas tax, and we're putting more money back in your pocket. It's about listening and getting it done for the people.
Well, he finishes where they started, Keith, as far as the Liberal ad is concerned. Anyway, I just throw it out there. What's your thought?
It's a pretty positive ad overall. I mean, he's reinforcing the exact message he wants to get out. I'm in it for you. I'm going to lower your cost of living any way I can. I'll never impose a tax increase. The only sour note to me in that particular ad was mentioning even Bonnie Crombie. Why bother? Just literally, like, he's painted her profile has risen more in PC ads than in any other platform. So why even mention it at this point? Just clearly, she's posing some kind of a threat that the New Democrats are not to the PC government. And I'd really like to know what their polling is showing. Why such a strong focus on them as opposed to the official opposition party? That's very curious. But overall, that ad, that's exactly the kind of, hey, I'm a nice guy. I'm a guy you can have a beer with. I drive my own car. which I thought Premier Wynne, you were not allowed
He
to drive when you were
He
Premier.
doesn't drive his own car. It's all, I mean, the ad's BS. He doesn't drive his own car. He doesn't pump gas. He doesn't do any of that shit. So, right. I mean, it's that ad. Yeah,
We're going to have to flag that one for the radio audience now.
Sorry. It's a good ad. Of course, it's a good ad, but it's exactly why the other ad was made, right? Because that image of him as this guy doing all these good things, none of which have good evidence for them, right? I mean, we've talked about building roads that aren't needed. We've talked about safer injection sites that actually are not the scourge that he's talking about. So all the stuff that he's doing, which he's painting, they're putting the best face forward. And it's the reason that other ad has to exist.
Well, John, we're back to this whole idea of perception as opposed to something that is grounded in real research and reality. I mean, he's quoting things that are anecdotal, but he's getting a lot of runway and traction out of it.
I suppose, but look, I think let's look at both sides of the coin. Number one is this was an ad that was on brand, on message, and is totally believable. I mean, it's not a graduate seminar on advertising. It is straightforward, right out of the political handbook, and there you go. It works really well. I think the other side, though, with people like Bonnie Crombie, we're not seeing her, and it's also a question of explaining. I mean, the Liberal ad takes a lot to explain. And when you're explaining about a whole lot of things and you're not driving a whole lot of things, then you're kind of losing, and it's it's not having the traction that it needs. So I'd say, again, on the same analogy, this is a touchdown as opposed to a fumble, and the Liberals have got some cleaning up to do to get back in the game.
Tim?
I'd have two questions to the person behind the ad, or group of people. Who are you? Because I thought it was a masterpiece. I thought it was a Picasso. I thought it was a Rembrandt for where we are at this stage. I'm on side. I got the blue on right?
His head.
Oh,
it was like leap out of your chair. Good. And this like right on brand. So magnificent. My second question too would be the targeting. So Keith's point, why do they contrast with Bonnie Crombie there as opposed to Marit Stiles? And I'd be curious if it's targeted certain audiences, because there's no doubt, Keith, that there's an NDP conservative battle in southwestern Ontario. You do radio out of Windsor, Niagara, and northern Ontario. So maybe they didn't weight it as much as they would, GTA, Ottawa. But geez, hats off, Dave. I thought that was brilliant and big on brand. And I think he does drive his car, by the way. I saw him with a shovel getting people out of the store.
Yeah, true.
A little red plastic one.
Well, let's get back to the on brand. In the scrum this week, the Premier was responding to a City of Toronto report that it was going to cost nearly $50 million to remove the bike lanes that he doesn't like.
It doesn't cost $50 million. That's a bunch of hogwash. We're going to show them how to do it for a lot less and get traffic moving. We're going to keep bike riders safe. Simple as that. And we're going to get the traffic moving.
Again, it's on brand, Tim, but there is as much evidence on both sides of this to suggest that if you leave the bike lanes alone, they're fine. Nor do we know for sure that there's anything wrong with the City of Toronto numbers at $48 million.
All right, so maybe it's not going to be Boris Johnson on a bulldozer, but maybe Doug Ford with a jackhammer, right? Like this, the more you talk about this, the better it is for the Conservative government and their voting universe. And look, you could argue it's going to cost $40 million or $40,000. All people hear is Doug Ford is taking out these bike lanes that are driving me nuts and going to stop more crazy decisions. So, like, Olivia Chow will have to satisfy her base and those are on the side. But I think the more she fights it, the better it is for Premier Ford. If I were mayor, I'd look for some trade-offs somewhere else, maybe money for police or for homelessness or, nonprofit housing, some kind of deal. Because, man, every time I see this, it's working for Doug.
But where do you land then on Mike Schreiner's comment that that $48 million isn't just being spent by people in Toronto, it's being spent right across the province. So some of John Wright's relatives in Ottawa Valley are putting up money to take out these bike lanes, and they're not getting any benefit out of it.
Yeah, I don't think that's gonna hunt, right? I just think that's just, if you do the math on that, it's so small. Plus, I don't think folks necessarily in Mississauga or in Kitchener-Waterloo or Ottawa are happy too. Some of those examples were made by the transportation minister as well. But look, the more they talk about taking out bike lanes or building more of them, the better it is for the government.
John, it occurs to me that we're into a faith-based campaign, and I say that because everything starts with "we believe." I believe that there is no such thing as. I don't believe that it costs $48 million. There's no real fact or knowledge necessarily in terms of the base of it. The conversation always starts with, "This is what I believe and I think."
Yeah, I suppose if it costs you $24 million to put something in and it's going to cost you $24 million to take it out, then you want your investment back. So that's $48 million. But I think to Tim's point, I mean, people are not listening to that. I think the dynamic changed when Don Stewart took St. Paul's. I think they believe that there's some traction in the heart of Toronto as opposed to the edges of it. And I think they're driving an issue that people in Midtown Toronto can relate to where they wouldn't have been able to relate to it before. So I think they're onto something here, and you can have all of the discussions now, which may come up about a charter city to protect Toronto from provincial meddling. I don't think that's, again, going to have much traction to a group of people which represent at least half or 60% of the city who don't vote for Olivia Chow, who are looking for somebody in an upcoming election campaign to represent their views. So I think it's got good traction.
When you, to John's point, Kathleen, heard David Miller on talking about his role in sort of pursuing that idea, didn't necessarily talk about, being a chartered city, but the stability and the independence of the municipalities. I mean, you were the one that said you can't have tolls on the Don Valley Parkway. So,
well, yeah. I mean, I said that in the context of there had been no discussion regionally, and it's true. I mean, if there were going to be tolls on the Don Valley Parkway, there should have been a discussion at the mayor's table that I had set up, and John Tory didn't bring that to the mayor's table. We didn't have that discussion. We were talking about integrated fares, but we hadn't talked about tolls. So that's why I said no, because I wasn't ideologically opposed to tolls. We created the high occupancy toll lane. So, what really worries me about this conversation that we're having, and what worries me about politics right now in the province or the really nationally, is that, John said when you're explaining, you're losing, and that's true. But when you're obscuring the truth, you may be winning. But that doesn't mean that you're going to have a better city. It doesn't mean you're going to have a better province. It doesn't mean you're going to have less congestion, And so it really worries me that the casualty in, good politics is that we're really not talking about good policy. And I think that, I'm not actually making a partisan comment here, I'm actually saying, could we just talk about what actually works and what doesn't work? Because if we don't, then decisions are going to be made that are going to have ramifications later. If that crosstown subway that had a hole dug in it in the late 90s, if that had continued, we would be having a different conversation about transit in this city. But, a conservative government filled in that hole. We didn't continue, bad policy. And so we had to play catch up a decade later. So I really wish we could talk about good policy and do the things, whether it's a conservative government or a liberal government or an NDP government, do the things that are actually based on evidence that are going to improve the city, the province, the country.
To use Tim's comment, Keith, that dog don't hunt these days, I don't think.
Well, okay, but Dave, we've got that, maybe not. And I've heard people say, that the reason political parties exist is to win elections. Well, I would argue the reason political parties exist is to advance good policy that's going to make our society better. And if that's not the case, then what is the point? What is the point of government? I thought the point of government was to do things that people can't do for themselves that are going to make the world work better for the greatest number of people. That's not what we are. That's not what we're seeking right now. And I think it's a huge problem. And I think in a way, we've got to say, okay, the emperor has no clothes in this debate. And let's talk about what's really good for people. I know it's a problem. I know that the mechanisms of politics don't lend themselves to that discussion. But honest to goodness, Dave, when I think about the world my grandkids are going to live in, that's the conversation we should be having.
Yeah, Keith, I mean, I get the philosophical and the aspirational perspective on this, but we've created a culture, whether at any level, and we talked a little bit about it last week in terms of just the culture of kids being nasty and disrespectful, and how it's sort of seeped into, or it's been at the hub of a lot of what we're talking about. It's going to be really difficult to take all the worms out of that can and reorder them.
Well, I think the biggest problem with this was the city coming out and saying it's going to cost $48 million to remove the bike lanes. Talk about overplaying your hand, or just going way too far. Because Doug Ford was able to come back with, again, he's had no scientific evidence about bike lanes and causing traffic congestion or anything else. There seems to be more that, their evidence is either outdated or basically wrong, false. But yet he's bang on when he calls $48 million to remove them. Hogwash. That's all. That sums it up right there as far as most people. And to the point about policy versus good practices here, to most people, spending $48 million to remove bicycle lanes on 3 Toronto streets is bad policy. It's just bad spending of money. Now, is it $48 million? I think Keith's bike lane removal company figures we could do it for $40 million and save the city, $7-8 million. But that's yet to be seen. I have to get a better hand on the figures. But this is just such a ludicrous thing. And to Tim's point, it just plays every single time right into Doug Ford's hand. I'm going to remove those damn bike lanes and make traffic flow better. There's no scientific evidence to back it up. That too could be hogwash, but it works, and it's playing right now. And especially on this particular debate, the cyclists are going to have to start picking better routes that are not on main streets and getting them built there. Because the way it is right now, he's won this argument, and it's not going to reverse. I don't think anybody can reverse it on this one.
Yeah, I'd be too on that, Dave. Like we beat the horse and put the whip down and around the politics on this. But I do think on the policy front, like I've not been at a city municipal level, granted, but was it really necessary for extending bike lanes to take out that many lanes on the most major arteries in the province of Ontario, or were there other options? And hopefully these should be revisited so you could have some bike lanes, but not the level of disruption that we've seen.
But I think let me just add something else too, because yes, I drove my car into the city the other night, believe it or not, because there is no reliable subway system for me to use. And even on News Talk 1010 this week, I mean, they had people on talking about, well, in Paris, they've got this and they've got that. I mean, Paris, if anybody's been to it, the labyrinth of available transit in that city is incredible. Like, it's just incredible. It has nothing to do with what we have here. But I tried to get downtown the other night. Below DuPont, you can't go anywhere. University's got construction on it that narrows below Bloor Street, and the backup was so far up. Okay, so you go over on Davenport, you try to hit St. George. No, it's blocked. You can't turn left there. Bedford's completely tied up below Bloor Street. Spadina's down to one lane. Crossing over into down near Wellington Street is completely blocked as well. Like, it seems like no one is listening, no one is coordinating, and all we've heard since John Tory was, yes, we have a committee that's going to coordinate this. Really? That's what's going on. You add to that personal, visible frustration that people have when they're trying to get around in this city, a whole argument about bike lanes that are empty, as I said last week, up in near Eglinton Avenue. My goodness, the only ones you ever see there, every hour you might see 3 Uber Eats delivery bikes going across there. People are going, who is standing up for common sense in the city? And I think that's where people are at. Yeah, I know I said common sense, but that's a phrase which rings true in this neighborhood, that's for sure. And I think that's putting Doug Ford more in the driver's seat than somebody who will oppose him.
Last week, we touched on the Premier's initial response to the idea that we're going to have to revisit free trade. This week, he was on the phone with the Premiers and apparently got some consensus on that idea.
Just got off the phone with all the Premiers, and there's a clear consensus that everyone agrees that we need a bilateral trade deal with the U.S., and a separate bilateral trade deal with Mexico. We know Mexico is bringing in cheap Chinese parts, slapping made in Mexico stickers on, shipping it up through the US and Canada, causing American jobs to be lost and Canadian jobs. We want fair trade. And I'll give you an example. In just Ontario alone, we do $40 billion of two-way trade with Mexico. We import $36.5 billion. We only export $3.5 billion. That's not fair trade. Compared to the U.S., we do approximately close to $500 billion, and it's almost split right down the center, give or take a couple $1 billion.
I'm not sure there's anything necessarily to argue in there, Kathleen Wynne, but it's interesting to hear that there is consensus among the premiers that this is the tack that we want to take.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you read some of the other premiers' comments, they're in agreement in terms of an initial gambit. You know, I still think this is a catalyst to a conversation with the federal government and how they're going to approach the discussion around the trade agreement. And I think it's smart. I think it's an interesting tack for him to go on, and I think it resonates with people. You know, it makes sense to people.
Tim, I mean, last week we were talking about who's the audience for that, and clearly it's the Trump administration. How much of this is sort of standing as one in terms of a unified voice to make sure that Ottawa is hearing?
Well, it worked. It worked, right? Because then the Prime Minister also came out and made a similar point about maybe Mexico shouldn't be part of this. So two main comments. Number one, last time around, when it comes to automobiles, there was a similar play where Canada and the U.S. allied and took on Mexico when it came to car manufacturing. It is a major part of Ford's economic plan, new vehicles, electric vehicles, the batteries. So perfectly consistent with this point of view. And it worked last time because Mexico then had to pay a certain wage for manufacturers in Mexico, which kept a lot of jobs in Canada and the States, and that grew jobs. Number two, look, I know I'm being a bit of a fanboy, but look, this is a premier who's been 6 years in office, and he's still predominantly on offense. And I thought he came across very statesmanlike there to rally the other provinces and move this issue forward. So that ain't easy to do, you know, at any particular time. But if you're 6 years and you're still pressing in the other team's ice, it's pretty good.
Well, and Keith, the other side of this is, and we sort of touched on this through other points of the conversation, this is bipartisan, or not even, it's more than bipartisan. We've got three different parties all involved here who are saying, yes, we're all in favor.
Yes, it's curious. I think it's an opening position, and it's in a sense we're giving away part of our bargaining position for the 2026 renegotiation of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement by saying we're willing to throw Mexico right under the bus. They're not playing fair, and we want a series of bilateral agreements. Well, if the United States strikes a bilateral free trade agreement with Canada and strikes another bilateral free trade agreement with Mexico, and we strike one with Mexico, well, the United States is going to be in the hub, aren't they? They're going to be the one that can locate your factories there and export to both Canada and the United States. How does that benefit Canada and Canada and Mexico? How does that benefit Canada to throw Mexico out of this right now? I think there's a real danger there. As I say, I think we're giving away a key negotiating position fairly early. But to Premier Ford's point, you know, he's clearly trying to protect the auto sector more than anything. And to get the 13 premiers all on side, and even the Prime Minister, who's, you know, not got a lot of room left to govern himself, he's feeling the pressure as well. He said he brought this up with the new Mexican president, this issue of how they're treating the Chinese imported products. So maybe there's something that will actually come out of this that's to Canada's benefit. But right now, I see it as I think the bilateral agreements as opposed to a trilateral one would be a step backwards for Canada in particular.
And you made the point last week, John. Just keep in mind that it's unlikely that there's that the Prime Minister is going to have a whole lot of say in what the final decision is on the free trade agreement.
Yeah, maybe true. But I think again at these early stages, you're skirmishing for position on this. It's also the case that we have a new ambassador named to Canada who comes from Michigan, so that is a very close ally of Ontario because they understand the border situation here. And we also then have immigration, which, you know, Mark Miller was out this past week saying, look, you know, it's as much an issue for people coming over the border in Mexico as they are coming over the border from the United States into Canada. And we share a joint responsibility in that. Borders matter. And I think that's where Canada is going right now. And it's like a little bit like shadow boxing at the outset of a bout. You're lining up all kinds of different scenarios here, and we've yet to get into the real fight.
And Dave, if I can just say, you know, in 2016, when Trump was when he was elected the first time, we had already started, I was premier, we had already started working with governors. We had already started making the arguments about the interdependence at that point we were talking about Ontario and the 20 states that we, that we're a major trading partner with. But I think that, you know, Ford he's built on that. And when he was elected in 2018, the federal government had already come on side, and, you know, his epiphany around electric vehicles has helped in terms of the battery plants and so on. But I think that he's doing the right thing in terms of working now with the other premiers, taking a strong stance, and the federal government coming in behind. That's exactly what happened in 2016. It took the federal government, they came in behind us, and we were working with Alberta and the other provinces to establish that position with states. So I think that he's on a good track. Like Keith, I'm not sure we're going to end up with a whole bunch of bilaterals. We may actually end up with a revised free trade agreement, but it's not clear that that's where we're going now. I just think that this actually is early days in the negotiation.
Well, let's get to some of the other headlines that popped up this week. And, off the top, we had mentioned that we got a finger wagging and a corrective note from the finance minister on our talk around booze in the corner stores and the convenience stores and the grocery stores, et cetera. Well, there's news out this week that, in fact, the rollout apparently has saved a lot of stores from closing. And that's according to the Ontario Convenience Store Association. But, at the same time, John, a few weeks back, there was still some worry about how they manage the returns and so on. So I don't know that has entirely been solved. I can see that, that the walk up to the convenience store might have changed as a result of having, your favorite 6-pack on the shelf, though.
Yeah, but I mean, this accomplishes a goal that the Canadian Convenience Store Association has had for some time, and that is to increase traffic. I mean, when you take a look at it's an interesting reflection on the fact that what drove people into those stores many years ago was simply going in to get tobacco products, and as a result of lower consumption rates on tobacco, and also more importantly, the contraband that's going out across the country, it reduced traffic. And we all know that's why you put milk at the back of the store, so people will go and get the milk, and as they walk through the store, they get those chips, and I'll pick up this and I'll pick up that. It's all about getting traffic. The reality is, even if I go into the corner store, I was in Sobeys last night and noticed that an entire area that normally is for vegetables has now got Sapporo beer in it. So it's happening everywhere. You see it in the corner stores and you see it in the gas stations. It's the traffic, and it may not be heavy at the moment, but you're starting to recognize it in places where people are, picking up a pack and they're picking up a couple of other things and they walk out of the store. I just think it's inevitable that it's there. It's rolling out well. There's no controversy. I was thinking last night as I was walking out of the store, I haven't heard of any robberies, right? Like there was a lot of arguments saying it's going to have lots more opportunity for that to take. I haven't heard about that. All I'm hearing about is, more traffic, and it's good to supplement now these convenience stores because they've lost traffic from the diminishment of the cigarette trade. So I think it's got to be working for everybody at the moment.
Yeah, Tim, I wasn't necessarily going to the convenience store in the day to buy smokes, but, I can't remember the last time I walked in. And there's 2 convenience stores in the little strip mall at the end of our street. And I might have been in there once in the last year. So if this is helping them, maybe that's the answer.
It's a big benefit for sure. The main driver of this is convenience. Time for, average Ontarians just want to grab a beer or a bottle of wine or a ready-to-drink beverage. But it has the added benefit of spurring a local economy. So let me tell you a bit of a story here. It's no surprise to me, and I'm glad to see this, because when I was consumer minister, we had a rapid expansion of agency stores. Now, you'd see those in small town Ontario where a convenience store could sell LCBO products and beer store products. And Dave, I had 3 of these in my riding, some within 10 minutes of my house. And they were lined up through holidays. And people go in there, they'd buy their 6-pack, they'd buy some chips, they'd buy something else. In fact, in one community just outside of Aurelia, they kept so many dollars in the smaller town as a result of this that they got an upgrade from a Foodland to an IGA or whatever the chains were at that time, because it kept local dollars local. I'm really pleased to see this initiative is having this spin-off benefit as well. And so I won't suffer the wrath of the minister the third time. Convenience stores don't have to take empties unless they want to. Got to get that in.
Noted. Check. This story kind of gained some traction this morning before we all gathered, and it was more around the you talk about, convenience, and if you're not going in there for the beer, you might have been going in there for a bottle of water. But the largest bottle water producer is pulling out of Ontario. Now, it's not clear from the story exactly why, but there's a good deal of meat on this bone, and whether it has to do with, again, sort of that bottle return, the recycling process that is in place right now, whether that's too arduous. The company isn't saying out loud what it is, but has been a lot of pushback on this particular company because it started out as the Nestle water. They were able to get our water and sell it back to us. So there's a lot bubbling under the surface, literally and figuratively here, Kathleen Wynne. And we lose jobs if this happens, but at the same time, don't quite get if in fact the recycling is the issue, then shouldn't that be out loud? I mean, there's a lot of ifs, maybes, and buts around this story.
Yeah. So let me just start by saying that, the 200 jobs, if that's the number, you got to feel for those people, and it's a problem. And, I would hope that there'll be a decent transition for them into other work. So that's a real problem. But I have to say that I think the bottled water industry is from my perspective, one of the most ridiculous developments of our contemporary society. We have in this province, in this country, we have good, clean tap water. There are all sorts of reasons that we shouldn't be drinking out of plastic bottles to start out with. I suspect, Dave, that the company, I don't know, obviously, but I suspect that it's partially about the recycling and partially about the water taking fees that we put on in 2016. And I don't think they've been decreased. I was looking on the Minister of the Environment website. And so, as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing, because they were taking our water for a ridiculously low amount of money. And I just think that we have to find ways as a society to make it clear that this industry is not something that we think is sustainable over the long term. So I'm sorry about the people who are losing their jobs, but I'm not sorry that this business is in trouble.
I always thought that the economics of bottled water, John, was really skewed, because if you actually think about it, you can buy a liter of gas in this province for less than you buy a half a liter of water in a plastic bottle. But we've kind of culturally just decided that that's okay. But again, back to the water out of the tap. If you look at what it actually costs you to fill that water bottle, that same water bottle with the tap water here in Toronto, it's pennies on the dollar.
Exactly.
Yeah, it is. And secondly, look, if an equity fund decides to move elsewhere, and let's no bones on this, but this company was producing every year, if it was 8-ounce bottles, 2.55 billion bottles. It's incredible how much water they were producing. If there's a benefit in this with a margin in it, somebody also step in and save those jobs. I think most people would just look at this and go, if they had less bottles in the grocery store or in the convenience store, it wouldn't bother them one bit. The real issue for me is understanding the dynamics of what is causing them to leave. I mean, it's a lucrative market. One would wonder why. It costs a $503.71 per million. They were taking out 639 million liters. So I'm sorry, $503 per million liters versus the 639 million liters. There's a huge margin in all of this. So I don't understand why they'd be heading out. It just seems strange to me.
Well, they did raise the specter, Tim, of the recycling issue and the regulations now, requiring the producer of the product to actually deal with the recycling of their own, leftovers. You know what? I got to say, I think they should be responsible for it. I mean, I don't know why it's on me.
Let me tell you, I think that is the tipping point. The Premier and I would be familiar with this issue. It's been long-standing around Nestle, and it divided the community there in Puss Lynch, and it was a major employer, source of revenue. And now it looks like the plant is closing. So, number one, I'll confess, we have bottled water in our home. I don't want to shock anybody. Don't want to look down at me, but we have bottled water. We have our thermoses as well. It's a popular choice by consumers, and it's probably better than drinking water than some other products all the time. But look, the main thing here, I think the tipping point actually was the change around Blue Box, where they're making, rightly so, producers to pay those expenses. But because there's more value in plastic and glass beverage containers, they have to pay for the areas that don't get as much in the marketplace, like, less valuable plastics and such. So there's a huge increase in cost to this bottling plant. And I suspect that was the tipping point of why they're going to closure. Let me throw a last point out there. In hockey, they have the Lady Byng Memorial Trophy. It goes to the most sportsmanlike player. If we had something like that in politics, I think the Premier would agree with me, and Keith and John. Norm Miller, who was longtime Parry Sound Muskoka MPP, would have won that award. And he was in my caucus, and he always championed deposit return. And this is the way you handle beverage, whether it's alcohol or non-alcohol, in pretty well every other province or state. I remember being a kid and picking up pop bottles and not water bottles going around back then, bringing them in so I get my Batman comic, right? People will hoover these things up. And the return rates when you do that for the environment, like in Alberta, is close to 80-some%, whereas we're at 51% in Ontario. A lot of ideas that I champion that are being done by government. I'm happy about that. One they should do is deposit return. So everybody else does. Then there's an incentive to recycle valuable material and put it back into the marketplace. So far, they haven't done that. I think it's probably a tide they don't want to be seen as, increasing costs. But man, you get that money back. And I'd really like to see that happen down the road.
Okay. I know I
got to jump in on this. I know
Yeah.
you're late. Their product is plastic bottles. It's not water. They were paying $3.71 per 100 million or per 100 million liters. And Kathleen Wynne's government added $500 to that per million liter cost. But they're absolutely leaving because they don't want to pay this recycling fee. Nestle, which of course this all started in around 2015, Nestle outbid the small town of Wellington Center for their well that they were going to need for the town's expansion. And that happened. Then Nestle took a lot of bad publicity. They sold in 2021. And I think this hedge fund bought in because they thought it was still a business to be had here. But the recycling fee is the only reason they're bailing out right now. Because, the water is still, even at $503.71, it's still virtually free. Their product is plastic bottles. They need to take full responsibility for it, whether it's deposit return or something. But that's their product. It's not our water.
But the point I want to drive, and I don't see, water companies as a Montgomery Burns sort of, caricature in our province. But on the main point, because of the system we're using currently, the bottling companies, plastic or glass, are paying a much higher fee than they would otherwise. A deposit return would assign the cost to them and to the consumer and send it to return it. This is a far more expensive system. So maybe they'd be still operating if you had a deposit return system.
Yeah, maybe.
All right. Well, let's leave it there. I know we wanted to get into Mike Moffat's numbers on housing, Tim. So we'll make sure we hit on that next week, and because I have a feeling that's not going to go away in the next 7 days. So let's deal with that and lagging housing starts here in Ontario. I thought one of the comments made, it was interesting. If the Ontario government is blaming high interest rates, then it's interesting to see how the other provinces aren't dealing with the same interest rates because they have better housing starts. But we'll pick that scab next week when we reconvene on The Ledge. Keith Leslie, John Wright, Tim Hudak, and Kathleen Wynne, thanks for being here this week. It is always a pleasure. And we remind you that you can subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can follow us on all of the podcast applications, Apple, Spotify, etc., iHeart, and make sure that you do click the subscribe and follow button, because then we end up in your app without any issue, and you can follow us throughout the week. Leave us a comment, by the way. If you've got something to say about the show, we want to hear from you. And there's also a talk back message feature on this as well. I'll leave that link in the show notes for the program, and all the comments that we get, I'm happy to we'll sift through and add your voice to this show. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN
Story Studio Network.